Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's December 21st, 2024. 'Tis the season for the nativity, yes, but also for the annual COVID shot. If you have a question as to what the uptake is at this point in time, the Economist YouGov polling organization has an answer for us. They did a survey of 1,600 people over the last week and asked one of the questions that were asked of respondents who have taken a COVID shot this year or plan to within the year. 27% of American adults have already taken a shot, and another 10% say that they plan to do so. So that's just under 40%. Well over 1/3 of all Americans are still getting their COVID shot uptakes, and the partisan distribution is pretty stark. 51% of Harris voters have already taken the shot, and another 16% say that they plan to. So that is upwards of 70%. More than 2/3 of Democrats have had a COVID shot in the current year, compared to just 13% of Trump supporters who have taken it and 4% who say that they plan to within the year. So that's less than 1/5 of Trump supporters compared to 2/3 of Harris supporters. And before introducing or reintroducing a character who will join us today, I'm going to go ahead and put a conspiracy that has been bouncing around in my head out. It hasn't settled with me completely. It may be my ego talking here, but I haven't really come to terms with how accepting the power structure seems to have been with Trump's re-election victory and presumption of taking office again a month out. And maybe it was the scenario really playing out that I had convinced myself could be a possibility, not the most likely on election night, but one that seemed plausible, which was that Trump would win by so much that there would be no real attempt to steal the election from him. But as I alluded to just now, that hasn't really completely set well with me. And looking here at these differential uptake results by partisan affiliation, if there was a scenario in which a real deadly virus, like something with mortality rates in the range of avian flu, where mortality is between 10 and 50%, if some virus like that is engineered or is released or however it gets out into the general population, if it were to occur in a cultural landscape, the political cultural landscape that we have now, and there was a vaccine, an actual inoculation against that worked, then we could have a situation based on these uptake results that would result in a massive depopulation event that would be exactly in line with what the powers that be would like to see happen, where Trump supporters don't get the shot and the Harris supporters do. Jeff, am I off base here?
Well, Ness, I'm happy to be back. Thanks for caretaking while I was gone. So my thoughts are that anti-vax sentiment, at least in the United States, is primarily on the left. I was thinking if you went back in the mid-2000s and you were an apolitical person, didn't have association with the right or the left, Republican or Democrat, and let's say your issue was raising concerns about vaccine efficacy, safety, potential links to autism, which side of the political spectrum would you find a more receptive audience for your anti-vax or at least skeptical views of vaccines? And my thought would be you'd go to the left. That's where you'd find more sympathy. And I think of, this could be stereotype, but I think of the granola eating, composting, white liberals on the West Coast and Portland, Oregon. They're going to be the ones that maybe don't just take every vaccine that the doctor tells them to, has their questions whether their children really need all these vaccines. And I unlike Ness, who would never raise something like this without data, I don't have any polling data on this. It's more just a feeling I have. We can maybe look into whether it's backed up in any way by data, but so my question is, why is there such a higher vaccine uptake among people on the left, Harris supporters, rather than Trump supporters. Because if my theory is true that historically people on the left are more opposed to the vaccine, and then add to or more skeptical of vaccines in general, then add to Trump pushing the vaccine really hard and encouraging everyone to get it, yet his supporters still, the majority still did take the vaccine, but the uptake of the vaccine is a lot lower among Trump supporters. So what I'm asking is, why did things turn out that way? I could easily envision a scenario where it's the left that was skeptical of the vaccine, but that's not the case.
Well, there's a lot there. My first reaction is to question how distinct the partisan differences in terms of vaccine hesitancy have been over time. Growing up, I don't remember it being anywhere near the salient issue that it is today. And so if there was opposition or hesitancy to vaccines, it probably existed in the single digits. And as far as the political orientations of those people who were vaccine skeptical, they may have been larger on the left or larger on the right, but in either case, they represented a very small fraction of the left and a small fraction of the right, and in both cases did not have contingents that had much influence in broader cultural or political movements within the parties. The libertarian strand of the right wing in America has traditionally been vaccine hesitant and skeptical of vaccine mandates, and the libertarian movement in the United States is primarily associated with the right, with the Republicans, beyond its independent party presence, which has been negligible and continues to be negligible. Most of that energy ends up finding its way into the GOP. But on the other hand, we have the very salient example of RFK, who has spent the better part of half a century advocating a strong skepticism of the modern American vaccine schedule, particularly with regards to vaccines that have been added in that half-century period of time. It's not just the big four, it's not just polio and measles and tetanus. There are all kinds of other viruses that are vaccinated for, such that children get close to 70 vaccines by the time they reach adolescence if they follow the suggested vaccine schedule completely. Getting vaccines for things like HPV, which is a sexually transmitted virus, not necessary for the vast majority of children, at least children that are not in classrooms with teachers who have the rainbow flag on their walls. Unless your kid's kindergarten teacher uses pronouns they, them, you don't have much to worry about in terms of your child contracting HPV.
So I was wrong. The skepticism towards vaccines is actually up until through the early 2000s, the skepticism was actually a little bit higher among Republicans than Democrats. However, like we were said, there's very little partisan divide. It's one poll we saw said about 62% of Republicans believed it was extremely important for parents to have their children vaccinated, and it was about 66% of Democrats who held the view that it's very important for parents to have their children vaccinated.
So that polling was from 2001, so this is well before, a generation before the COVIDian era.
And that makes sense. I was young at the time, and to the extent I followed politics, vaccine skepticism was never something that came up very often. It was never. I don't think most people would even consider it to be a right-left issue. Kind of like free speech used to be. It was something that wasn't coded as right or left. But it looks like sometime in the late 2000s, so the Obama years, that shift started to happen where Republicans became much more skeptical of vaccines and Democrats became less skeptical. And so we're trying to figure out what accounts for that for that divergence. Any thoughts on that, Ness?
I think you can trace back the movement on the right, broadly defined, all the way back to the end of the Cold War and Pat Buchanan's ultimately unsuccessful but still surprisingly vibrant campaign of 1992 that was characterized in large part by distrust in the existing power structure and a real concern that the country, the America as a coherent small R Republican entity, was at risk of being taken over by a neoliberal, neoconservative, New World Order establishment that was rhetorically something that was much more at home with George H.W. Bush, and that movement on the right, that grassroots movement on the right, although it did not constitute a majority of Republican voters, it was a sizable minority, and it would continue to grow through the 90s, through the Clinton years, such that in 2000, when George H.W. Bush ran and ultimately won the nomination for the Republican Party, he was closer rhetorically to Pat Buchanan, talking about a humble foreign policy and about potential trade restrictions and social conservatism. He was closer rhetorically to Pat Buchanan and ultimately would be closer to Donald Trump 20 years later, 16 years later, than he was to his own father a decade prior. And that distrust and disillusionment and disenfranchisement felt by an increasing number of people on the right continued not just through the 90s, but also through the aughts and the teens. It was, for a time, the movement was retarded by the events of September 11th and America's global war on terror that characterized much of the Bush administration, but that those frustrations and the issues that were driving them didn't go away, and it just kept building and building until Trump came onto the scene. And it wasn't like Trump started some novel movement based on his own inclinations that didn't have grounding in anything else that had come before. To the contrary, he ran to the front of the parade and galvanized people with his charisma and his notoriety and his method of delivery, his pugilistic rhetorical style. But it wasn't like he was whipping something up from scratch. He was a focal point for a movement that had been growing and growing and growing for 25, 30 years. And part of the growth in that movement was distrust in all of the institutional apparatuses in the Western world that had increasingly been found to be corrupted and increasingly not just indifferent to the well-being of the citizens of the United States, but actively hostile towards them. And this sense of distrust in the institutions, including the scientific establishment, were vindicated in the COVIDian curse and the events that transpired during those 2 years.
Let me run something by you, Ness, a theory that 9/11 and the war on terror was if not the inflection point in terms of the increasing skepticism and disillusionment that the right wing has towards the political establishment and conventional wisdom in general. To the extent that there was opposition to the war on terror, so the invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, it came from the left wing, at least in the United States. And the poster child, Sean Hannity, for ridiculous, unfair questioning of anybody who opposed what Bush and his cronies wanted to do, labeling them as unpatriotic, treacherous. So the right-wing base was largely on board with for instance, like we said, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. But sometime, so that'd be 2001, and then the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Sometime between then and when Donald Trump on the debate stage in 2015 called out W. Bush and said he lied us into war, I can remember all the establishment Republicans saying that, oh, that's the end of Trump's campaign. You can't get on the debate stage in South Carolina, of all places, and criticize the war on terror. And yet Trump's poll numbers went up after that. So what I'm saying is sometime in between 9/11 and the early W. Bush years and then 2015 when the Trump movement got going, there was a massive change in the sentiment, at least towards foreign policy, among the right wing in the United States. And is it possible that disillusionment and of course many disproportionately white boys and disproportionately right-wing white boys were the ones sacrificing their lives and limbs and mental health and to at the altar of these foreign excursions orchestrated by the Bush administration. So that disillusionment hit them even harder when they had skin in the game. And so my theory is that was that skepticism, that disillusionment that brought about by the realization that the war on terror was a fraud, was a disaster. That was a sort of Pandora's box. And once something when the wool was pulled over their eyes in such a dramatic fashion that just opened the doors for them to question many other things, and that one of them being vaccines.
I don't know that I can pinpoint specific events. I think the trend line is there through the 1990s and post 9/11 and through the war on terror and all the way into Trump's candidacy in 2016 and then the response to COVID. And the counterpoint I would make to the idea that it really was Trump creating some sort of break, I think the tipping of the balance in favor of the Buchananite America First contingent of the right, the inflection point was reached in 2015, 2016, but it had already been moving in that direction. And the evidence I would point to that shows that is that even though Trump was a big champion of the COVIDian response and the Operation Warp Speed and getting the vaccine out to as many people and then bragging about it, even though he did that, the MAGA movement didn't have anything to do with it because they were following Trump largely to the extent that Trump represented that or gave expression to that movement that had been building since the end of the Cold War, probably before then, but certainly traceable in my understanding of it from the Cold War all the way through to the present. If you imagine a hypothetical graph showing among Republicans, among those on the right, broadly defined, what percentages are more or less in line with the GOP establishment versus what percentages are more in line with the America First, MAGA movement, Buchanan brigade. I would imagine that the Buchananite wing represented, say, in 1990, maybe 30%, and you can imagine that percentage sloping upward steadily to 40% in 2000 and maybe 45% when the 9/11 attacks occurred, and then maybe dropping down again to 35% in response to that because of the shock of the events, but then continuing to steadily climb again such that by the time Obama had taken power in 2008, then maybe it was at 50% or around there, maybe around 50% in 2012 with Ron Paul's second presidential campaign that ultimately the nomination went to Mitt Romney and he lost in 2012. And there was a lot of resentment among that growing America First, MAGA Buchananite contingent about how the 2012 presidential campaign was one that should have been won and wasn't won. And then that, again, continued to grow into 2016 with Trump's ascendancy and has continued to grow since then through 2020 and into 2024.
Trump supporters are often accused of being in a cult and obeying blindly whatever their Führer leader, Trump, tells them. But the fact that Trump pushed the vaccine very hard, took credit for it, and yet his supporters constituted the strongest resistance to the vax mandates and taking the vaccines. That seems to contradict this theory that Trump supporters just blindly follow whatever Trump tells them. And then another possible explanation for why Trump so aggressively pushed the vaccines, and even after he left office, he was still, as I recall, telling people to take the vaccines. And in fact, one of the few moments when, as I recall, I can't remember exactly when it was, but when Trump truly seemed caught off guard was when he gave some line at one of his rallies praising the vaccine, saying it was a great thing, and his audience booed him. And like I said, it seemed like he was caught off guard by that. And so possible explanation for why Trump, who's generally has a pretty good pulse on what his supporters think, he seems to not really, doesn't seem to quite grasp the level of opposition that his own supporters have to the vaccine. I watched a movie recently that came out in 2024 called The Apprentice, and the movie details Trump as a young man in the late 1970s through the 1980s, his relationship with Roy Cohn. And at least the way the movie portrays it is Trump was a pretty soft-spoken, pretty normal businessman. And once he was taken under the wing of Roy Cohn, he totally transformed and slowly through the late 70s and through the 80s became the Trump we all know today. And Roy Cohn had 3 rules, at least in the movie, that Trump took to heart. Number 1, always attack. Number two, never admit wrongdoing. And number 3, always claim victory, even if defeated. And I think if you apply those 3 principles to the vaccine issue, it makes perfect sense why Trump would ever refuse to admit that he did anything wrong regarding the vaccine or that he had any missteps.
Those 3 rules that Cohn laid out definitely served Trump well, but I think they also serve the point that I'm trying to make here well also, in that Trump's effectiveness comes not from anything that he is coming up with on his own. He is taking that energy that didn't have an outlet, a way of expressing itself that was growing, and he was applying those Cohn principles to allow it to step into the ring of popular culture and the political world in a way that it had never really been able to before. But whenever he deviated from that, as in the case of advocating for his supporters to take the COVID shots, the mRNA shots, when they were opposed to doing so, they didn't fall into line, because those sentiments on the MAGA, America First, Buchananite right are genuine. They are not status signaling. They are not status concerned. They are not any of the things that characterize what is respectable or prestigious in the broader culture. Here's the clip, or one of the clips that I think you were referring to, Jeff, where Trump was booed at a rally when he was advocating for the vaccine to be taken. And this was in August of 2021, 6 months after he left office.
I recommend take the vaccines. I did it. It's good. Take the vaccines. But no, that's okay. That's all right. You got your freedoms. But I happen to take the vaccine.
Plebs, you got your little freedoms, whatever. Pivoting now to a topic that is somewhat related to COVID and vaccine hesitancy and vaccine mandates and healthcare more generally. YouGov also conducted a survey this week asking respondents whether or not they, quote, approve or disapprove of the murder of Brian Thompson, unquote, the United Healthcare CEO who was killed in Manhattan a couple of weeks ago. And what is particularly noteworthy to me here is that there is an enormous generational divide with those under the age of 30. So we're talking about Zoomers here primarily. 12% say that they approve, 18% say they neither approve nor disapprove, and then another 14% say that they prefer not to answer. And so that is added together, that's almost 50%. That's 44% of Zoomer respondents not explicitly saying that they disapprove of a cold-blooded murder in broad daylight of a CEO, healthcare CEO. Compare that to boomers, where 1% approve, 4% neither approve nor disapprove, and 3% prefer not to say. So we're looking at a 44% of Zoomers who will not explicitly disapprove of the murder of Brian Thompson, compared to just 7% of boomers who feel that way. And Xers and millennials follow a similar pattern, with millennials being closer to Zoomers' sentiments and Xers being closer to boomers' sentiments. But there is a clear and pronounced tendency for younger people in America to approve of the murder, and I think that's a pretty good proxy for frustration with the entire healthcare system in the Western world. And also, I've looked at previous surveys asking people about their perceived acceptance of violence to achieve political ends and cultural ends, and the same patterns emerge there, with younger people being much more accepting of violence as a means of achieving what they perceive to be their goals than older people do. And so that could presage a rocky future, a more kinetic future for the United States. I might have been a little convoluted in the way that I was relaying the results for the poll, because there's also a not sure answer that respondents give, and it is highest among Zoomers and lowest among boomers. There is one of the 5 answers, and this is a bit of a frustration with the way that the question is worded. There are 5 different answers. It would be probably more enlightening if it just said approve, disapprove, and maybe prefer not to say. But if we look at just the explicit disapproves, which again is one of the 5 options, 29% of Zoomers explicitly disapprove, 45% of millennials do, 71% of Xers do, and 90% of boomers disapprove. So that, stating it that way, makes it even more stark how enormous the generational differences are in terms of how the killing of Brian Thompson is perceived, with less than 1 in 3 Zoomers explicitly saying they disapprove of it, compared to 9 of 10 boomers saying so. So stating it that way, articulating it better, I think puts a more pronounced exclamation mark on the point I was trying to make in terms of the perceived acceptance of physical violence as a means of addressing grievances in the younger cohorts compared to the older generations. And so that comes to 60% of the total population disapproving explicitly. I would count myself among that 60% because constitutionally I have a need for order and a visceral opposition to chaos. And so I would answer that I disapprove, although there are degrees of strength of disapproval, and this doesn't make me nearly as angry as the transing of children or Haitians in Springfield, Ohio does. What do you think of it, Jeff?
I'm on the same page as you, Ness. I certainly disapprove of the killing of Brian Thompson, and it does, but at the same time, it does not work me up nearly as much as Haitians being dropped in Springfield, Ohio. Having said that, I am perplexed, and I don't know what to make of the amount of approval for what Luigi did for his murder of Brian Thompson. It's perplexing. I see memes on Facebook and on 4chan and other places that the meme is, for instance, I had a great time with my friend Luigi playing laser tag on December X, whatever date that Brian Thompson was murdered. Basically making it a joke, creating this jokey alibi ridiculous, over-the-top alibi trying to free Luigi. And the only thing I can think of is it's just a sort of reflection of internet culture as a whole, and a dehumanizing aspect that, for instance, you're playing your Nintendo Switch in your room, you're playing Super Mario World 1 minute, and then you take a break and you turn on your computer and you see a Luigi meme, and it's making a play off the alleged killer, Luigi Mangione killing Brian Thompson, and it's superimposed with the Luigi character from Super Mario Brothers. It's all just a big joke, and there's seemingly no thought that Brian Thompson had a wife and young children, and it's all just I guess a dehumanization or a disconnection. That's sort of a larger cultural issue, not limited to just this issue, but that's the only thing I can think of, again, of how you can look at somebody just sneaking up on somebody in broad daylight in Manhattan and shooting him in the back of the head, and you thinking that's acceptable.
Yeah, not just acceptable, but even praiseworthy. And I think you hit it on the head with the disconnect that modern media consumers have with the rest of the world. That's been, of course, accentuated since COVID and the remote nature of more and more of Western society, where so many people do not, that is how they experience reality. They don't experience it in the flesh. They experience the news the same way that they experience all of their entertainment and all of their social connections. It's all through screens. It's all virtual, and consequently, it is all based on social status and virtue signaling and curating a personality and a profile. And so it's disconnected from the more visceral, organic realities of life and the realities of someone, like you said, just having his brains blown out in broad daylight without any notice. And that being, again, not just deemed to be acceptable, but something that is laudable, that should be cheered. And we're stretching now a little bit more to tie these things together, although we are talking about side of some sort, CIDE, in this case, not homicide, but suicide, or as I'll get to in a second, may actually be homicide, coded as suicide, that isn't actually suicide. And what I'm referring to here is a reported suicide of a presumed subcontinental named Sujar Balaji. He was an OpenAI researcher turned whistleblower who allegedly killed himself in November. The details aren't something I'm going to get into here. I'm not qualified to give much of a perspective on it, but I think there is an important meta point here, and that is that as the ruling structure continues to, or perceives that it continues to lose control of population, of information, and of consensus building, and the ability to keep any sort of opposition down through soft methods of persuasion, through social shaming, and through controlling the Overton window, they will increasingly come to the conclusion that they need to employ more hard power when trying to assassinate someone's reputation or social status doesn't work. The next option is to just assassinate them outright. And so it is quite coincidental, fortuitously so for the deep state, that as this necessity for taking people out increases, so does social acceptance for suicide. Jeffrey Epstein is the most high-profile case of this in the last couple of years, but there have been many others. Like there's been a Boeing whistleblower who suffered the same suicidal fate that this OpenAI whistleblower did. Looking at the General Social Survey, which has going all the way back to 1977 through to the present, has asked survey participants if they believe that it is acceptable for someone who is, quote, tired of living, unquote, to commit suicide. When the question was first asked in 1977, 14% of respondents said yes. That figure has steadily risen over time to now in 2022, the last year that the survey was completed and the results were made public, 29% said yes. So it's more than doubled in that 40-year period, and the trajectory is that acceptance of suicide for people who are just tired of living will continue to grow over time.
Ness just did some cross-tabulation, and we were looking at how this feelings toward suicide and whether it's acceptable, how it correlates or overlaps with people who attend church regularly and people who are anti-abortion. And as would be expected, the same people who approve of suicide or at least find it acceptable are the same people who don't go to church and who approve of abortion or think abortion should be legal.
So in the question of suicide for people who are tired of living, among those who say that they don't attend church at all, over the course of a year, 28.3% say that they think it is acceptable for someone to off himself if he's tired of living, compared to just 5%, a little less than that actually, 4.8% of those who attend church several times a week saying the same. So 28% of non-churchgoers think that suicide is acceptable, compared to less than 5% of avid churchgoers. And on the question of whether or not a woman should be able to obtain an abortion for, quote, any reason, so this is the most permissive pro-choice position, of those who say yes, 31% say that a person should be able to kill himself if he's tired of living, compared to just 8% of those who do not think an abortion should be permitted if a woman wants it for any reason. So 31% saying yes on abortion support suicide, to just 8% who say no on abortion supporting suicide. And so the support for the homicide of somebody like Brian Thompson on the street, and the ability for people to take their own lives because they don't feel like living anymore, and for the ability of people to snuff out lives in the womb before they are brought to term, all of these things are tied together, and all of them are on the rise throughout the Western world, and they correspond to with a death and a decline of religiosity. So far as survival and reproductive fitness is concerned, I am of the mind that religiosity is very beneficial from a Darwinian perspective, perhaps ironically. I should note too that it's not just public acceptance of suicide, but also the acceptance and the implementation of it by the state in places like the UK and in Canada, and not far off, I would imagine, in the United States as well, where there will be the, quote, death panels, unquote, and things like MAID, medical assistance in dying, that is now one of the top 5 killers of people in Canada now is by way of medically assisted suicide. And so this general social acceptance and state sanctioning of suicide will also have the added benefit from the perspective of the state of being able to commit homicide on people and then cover it up as suicide with less scruples and fewer eyebrows raised than would have been the case a generation or two ago, when suicide was seen as much less acceptable than it is today. And the last thing I want to close on with today is more pop culture. Caitlin Clark, the female basketball star, was named Athlete of the Year. She is, of course, a white woman in a mostly black league. She's also a heterosexual in a mostly lesbian league, and it seems that she has paid some price for that, although I can only share what I've seen secondhand. I haven't ever actually watched any of the games myself, so I don't know how representative this is, but I've certainly seen clips and listened to segments about instances where it looks like she was pretty flagrantly fouled in pretty vicious ways over the course of the season. And there are many who have reacted to that by noting that that probably is anti-white and anti-heterosexual bias manifesting itself on the basketball court. Very well could be the case, but in terms of the reactions, public reactions to Caitlin Clark being named Athlete of the Year, not just Female Athlete of the Year, but overall Athlete of the Year, the approval rates by race don't vary much. This is taking the percentages of respondents who say that they approve of her being selected and subtracting from that the percentages who say they disapprove. For white, she has a plus 28 approval rating. For blacks, a plus 19 rating. And for Hispanics, a plus 17 rating. So in a league that is mostly black, and of course, professional sports, all the most popular professional sports are disproportionately, overwhelmingly black. Despite all of that, a white athlete being named Athlete of the Year, most blacks approve of that decision. I think as far as pop culture goes, and as far as it is strongly influenced by the zeitgeist, sports, say compared to television or music or any other kind of pop culture entertainment, is probably the least racially aware and most racially inclusive sector of popular culture. And I think this is evidence of that. Also, it is worth noting that among men, it's a plus 50% approving of her being Athlete of the Year compared to women just plus 37%. So although she is allegedly an example of female empowerment in sports, men are more interested in all sports than women are, even when it is a female athlete who is being put on a pedestal. Now, getting to that level of acceptance, multiracial inclusiveness, to garner that sort of support, it is required, or at least it's perceived to still be required, that she genuflect on the altar of diversity. And here ChatGPT gives us, quote, Caitlin Clark, recognizes Times Athlete of the Year, has recently emphasized the importance of acknowledging and uplifting black women in the WNBA. In an interview, she stated, I have to continue to try to change that. The more we can elevate black women, that's going to be a beautiful thing, unquote. And on that indeed truly inspiring note, that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.